They should pay them to get out of there, not to stay in there.
All right, thank you very much for the call. We're going to take you now to the National Press Club. And again, this is another one of the coalition groups forming around the country with their thoughts on events in the Persian Gulf and U.S. involvement there. Let's take a look at that now.
Let's not stick with a policy of pressure, diplomatic, economic, political. Let's go to war, and the sooner the better, because time is on their side, not on our side. For the sake of brevity, and to give my colleagues at the dais a chance, I will restrain my impulse to prolixity and read the statement that I think says tersely what we are all about. We are reaching out, we have reached out, we intend to further to prevent a war which we think would be a Holocaust. The Committee to Avert a Mideast Holocaust is building a coalition of conscience against the shrill cries of those who are openly urging the President to initiate a major war. I hardly need to give you a list. Your press kits contain comments from Kissinger and from the New Republic and from National Review who are saying, let's get on with the bombing before it's too late. Such a war in the Middle East, a tinderbox, we believe would exact a terrible toll of military and civilian casualties. It would destabilize the entire region. It would alienate the entire Arab world. It would shatter the very global consensus for a proportional response to Iraqi aggression that the President has achieved through the United Nations. It would jeopardize the industrial world's access to oil. It would endanger friendly governments in the region, and it would wreak havoc on our economy, an economy which, as you all know, is rather precarious anyway. In short, it would do irreparable harm, irreparable damage to our vital national interests. Conservative members of our coalition, our committee, and it started with some conservatives and libertarians, which are a wing, as it were, of the conservative movement, although Fred Barnes calls this whole thing a feather, not even a wing. He's the House conservative at the New Republic, in case you didn't know. We're especially appalled by the polemics of some conservatives whose calls for a massive first strike are accompanied by strident defamation of conservatives who disagree with them. They're called fringe groups, isolationists, Israel haters, chicken hawks. It's all in the press kit, and you've seen more of it. We believe that the current policy, which is one of economic and diplomatic pressure, should be given a chance to work. There are indications that it may be working. There's a report I heard on the radio this morning, I wouldn't vouch for it, that feelers have come out of Baghdad that maybe if they can hang on to the little island there and a few other concessions, they'd be willing to pull out of Kuwait. This, after all, is the announced policy of the President. It is the only policy the UN has approved of. It is the only policy that has achieved the support of moderate Arab states and the Soviet Union, and of course, as I said, the United Nations. We are astounded that some conservatives seem to imagine that unilateral American warmongering at this critical juncture will somehow usher in an improved world order. Now I'd like to invite my colleagues on the panel to also make short statements. If they're shorter than mine, that's even better. Mr. Joseph Sobran, who is a nationally syndicated columnist. His column appears regularly here in the Washington Times and, of course, around the country. Joe, would you care to say a few words?
Thank you, Phil. The distempered atmosphere of the past few weeks is happily beginning to give way to a sort of tough-minded calm. While it's far too early to relax, the prospect of war already seems a little less menacing than it did a few days ago when we began to assemble this group. It's been especially painful to me as a conservative to find so many of my fellow conservatives joining in the frightening war hysteria and hype. There was a time when conservatism meant skeptical opposition to the passions of the day. There was a time when conservatives were known, in fact, were rather notorious for their resistance to war fever. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, scorned them as isolationists. Today we're hearing that bullying epithet again, only this time conservatives themselves are using it. One wag has defined an isolationist as a man who'd rather trade with foreigners than shoot at them. This epithet is being thrown even at people who generally supported American military operations abroad, but who balk at being rushed into a major war in the Middle East, the most explosive region in the world. Apparently, a single demurral, any demurral, is enough to incur the charge of isolationism. Now think of what this implies. It means that there must be a sort of standing presumption in favor of war, or as we now call it, the military option. This strikes me as moral insanity. Surely a rational society should hold a contrary presumption. The man who urges a war, especially a war on the other side of the world, should bear a heavy burden of proof. Since he proposes to send thousands of other men to their deaths, men who are supposed to be our defenders, not our mercenaries, he should be forced to overcome our skepticism, our humane reservations, and even our natural inertia. The war advocates have failed to meet any such resistance. Instead, by the simple expedient of name-calling, they've shifted the burden of proof to those who see no sufficient justification for war, and having done this, refuse to listen to them. This is worse than unfair. It's a formula for short-circuiting public discussion and hurrying us into a disastrous war. When some voices are actually calling for the use of a nuclear threat against Iraq, it's preposterous to talk as if the chief danger we face is isolationism. Let's hope that the President won't be provoked to rash action, that Congress, as it reconvenes, will deliberate coolly and exert restraint, and that the American people will register their second thoughts about war through every channel available to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And in introducing you, I probably should have mentioned that you're a senior editor of National Review, one of the publications whose editorials I mentioned as one of those that are cheerleading us into a war. It's no secret that there is some dissent, not only at National Review, but by the way, at the New Republic. Not all of the editors there are in agreement with their bombs away policy. The next speaker is Phil Collier, who is an independent journalist who has written widely on the Middle East. Phil.
Well, I was called to join this press conference at 3 a.m., and so I haven't really prepared anything to say. I remember last week I read a column in the Washington Times by William Rusher, who is the original publisher of National Review, and he was talking about a proposed peace plan, I believe, by the Jordanian foreign minister. Now, I don't want to take a position whether this should be our policy or this committee should even endorse this policy. But I note that Mr. Rusher ended his column by saying that we, meaning the U.S., should reject this option, whatever the cost. I think that what we are trying to do is to point out what the cost might be. At the very minimum, it will be hundreds of American casualties, thousands, possibly tens of thousands of casualties in the Arab world. All of the regimes in the Persian Gulf are unstable regimes. They do not have popular support. They could easily be overthrown by popular upheavals. King Hussein is having trouble keeping the lid on in his country as of the situation is right now. He is having trouble. What would his situation be if there would be an all-out war? I'm not at all sure that Egypt would remain stable in the situation of an outright war. After all, the immediate predecessor of their present chief of state was assassinated over a much less serious situation than this. So what we are essentially saying is that we just like to at least talk about what the cost might be, because the people who are urging war have only been talking about imagined cost years down the road, which they think they will avert by major sacrifices of human lives right now.
Thank you. Now, Sheldon Richmond, who is a contributing editor of Liberty and who has written widely on Middle East issues. Sheldon?
I just wanted to make a very brief statement about this smear of isolationism. It's interesting that this word should be the word seized on by the people who want to rush headlong into a war. It couldn't be more inappropriate because it's, by and large, the members of this coalition and other people skeptical about this operation are advocates of free trade, international free trade, free migration, and cultural exchange among contractual parties all over the world. How can such people be isolationists? It seems to me they're skeptical about only one form of interaction with other countries, namely war. So to call people isolationists is really, as Joe said, a way of throwing up a smokescreen to put down skeptical questions, put down people who are trying to alert the public to the possible costs of this. If you want to see through this smokescreen, just ask yourself a simple question. How likely is it that someone would nuke his best customer? Thank you.
Thank you. Having lived up to my promise that we would have brief opening statements, I think the most interesting, the most revealing, and the most worthwhile part of this conference will be the question and answer period, which begins as of this moment. Do we have any questions? Yes. Oh, did I not introduce myself? I see it's all down here in the press kit. I'm Phil Nicolaides. I have a long and checkered career, including Deputy Director for Commentary and Analysis of the Voice of America, Associate National Editor of the Washington Times, and so forth. I won't go into these long credentials, and I just got through with 4 hours on the radio this morning in Washington. The name is spelled, which is sometimes difficult in your material, Nicolaides. I'm sorry, I did...
You appear to be the first organized opposition.
Could you identify yourselves for the purposes
yes.
of our vast whatever
I'm
audience?
Bob Costantini from CONUS Satellite News here in Washington.
Yes, sir.
You appear to be the first organized opposition to the deployment right now. Do you see any significance in that fact?
Oh, well, let me question on one point. There are some of us who feel that the military end of the response may have been disproportionate to the provocation and to the likelihood of ground combat. But what we are questioning essentially, I mean, some of us, not only those who are here, but others who have signed on and others who have assured us that they're with us. Some couldn't be with us because they're working for publications or organizations which as a matter of policy don't want their people to appear in a public forum of this kind. My personal opinion I'd be glad to give you, but our rock bottom position here is that the policy of putting economic, diplomatic, political pressure on the Saddam Hussein regime to back off its aggression against Kuwait is not an unreasonable policy. The President has said, his general just said it the other day, General Norman Schwarzkopf, there's no plan, there's no intention to launch a war from our base here. Our position is defensive. The military is there to protect Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates from any possible further aggression. The part of the policy that is designed to bring about changes in Iraq's policy is a non-military option. It's interesting that many of the people that are throwing names at anyone who isn't in favor of war today, if possible tomorrow, if necessary, they are people who try to co-opt the President's policy. They're telling us that what he really had in mind was not just getting Kuwait to back off, not just protecting Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, but in fact that the President will not achieve his goal until he topples the government of Saddam Hussein and in fact reduces Iraq to bouncing rubble, as it were. They'd like to see us bomb them, in the memorable words of General Curtis LeMay, bomb them back into the Stone Age. And some of the arguments they give, for example, well, if we don't get him now, just in a few years he'll have nuclear weapons and then he'll threaten the whole region, probably start lobbing them at New York and Washington. We think this is preposterous, but what is certain about it is not the President's policy, or at least the President hasn't told us it's his policy, and I don't think he would endanger 250,000 Americans with a covert objective that he hasn't told the American people about. That's what we are here to support, a measured policy that's reasonable to the provocation. There may be certain aspects of the policy, even thus far, which go beyond that. Some people feel, for example, I personally, I can tell you, feel that a boycott and an enforced embargo on such things as food and medicine is against American values and American principles. The UN resolution which authorizes us to enforce the boycott does not specifically exempts food and medicine. I don't know that Americans want to see diabetic patients go without their insulin or children go without necessities. And so I think on that point, for example, I personally think that the implementation has gone overboard. I think certainly adequate pressure can be exercised without producing starvation and people dying because they can't get medication. Yes?
Larry Lee with the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm just wondering if any of you appreciate at least the apparent irony in this, and some consistent libertarians may not be in this position. But I suspect that some
Libertarians
of you,
are always consistent.
I know. I
you.
say sometimes some people would say to a fault, but they're always consistent. I was saying they may not be in this position, but I suspect that some of the folks in your alliance, and tell me if this is true, hardly murmured a peep of dissent from the militaristic rhetoric of the Reagan years when it was in the context of the Cold War, and hardly denounced the attack on Grenada.
Well,
isn't that true?
Okay, on that point, I would say that I think a clear distinction can be, probably some of the people that will be supporting us now in this particular move were opposed to the to those military activities. What is, you talk about irony, when you have people in the Congress who urged the impeachment of President Reagan because he went into Grenada when our students were in danger and when a regime had blown itself away outdoors, killing the Prime Minister and some of his cabinet, and the Caribbean nations had urged us to take action. Blood was being shed. It was a dangerous situation, and it was a very minor operation. We weren't up against a huge, the fourth largest army in the world, armed with rockets, having gone through an 8-year war with a 1 million-man army. It's, I mean, you can't make distinctions like that. Sometimes an operation is appropriate. When there's a fire in the wastebasket, you can, get a fire extinguisher and put it out. You don't necessarily, for that, call in all of the engine companies in the area. So there are distinctions in military actions. I think most of the people in our coalition probably do not have a blanket pacifistic approach to everything. Certainly all of them would think that if American forces were attacked, if American civilians were harmed, that appropriate military action should take place. But here you have a situation in which no act was committed against the United States. Granted that the invasion of a small country, described by a writer in the New York Times, is not so much a country or a nation as a family-held oil company with a seat in the UN. But this small country, 200,000 of whose citizens live outside the country, 20,000 in the London area, which sit on an overseas investment trust of anywhere from $100 to $400 billion, where most of the people living in the country are not considered citizens, probably 60 to 80%. That this kind of country is not necessarily, attacking this kind of country while a violation of international law, while something that should be rebuked, is not necessarily something that assails the United States. No attack was made on the United States here. And it seems that certainly if an attack is made on the United States or our people gratuitously, then military response is appropriate, yes.
I'm Jim Fry with WFAA-TV of Dallas.
I used to live there, great town.
Definitely. People from the Free Kuwait group just a minute ago were conducting a news conference. 15 minutes ago they were saying the U.S. should be the power that makes sure that the world is safe, being the only major superpower left after the Cold War.
Ben Wattenberg calls us the omnipower. I suppose that makes us omnipotent.
Obviously you disagree with that, or do you?
Yes, I do, and I must say that I'm not overly impressed by the Kuwait as a terribly innocent victim in this. I think it's consensus that Kuwait was guilty of certain provocations arising from disputes within OPEC about who's exceeding their quotas and so forth. To put it somewhat crudely, if for the United States to go to war to keep oil prices down is legitimate, then maybe it's legitimate for Iraq to go to war to keep prices up. The truth of the matter is that in the 70s, for example, Iran, our great friend and ally, whose ruler ran just as police state a country as Iraq is, certainly, they, working in OPEC and against the wishes of Iraq and Saudi Arabia and others, pushed the price of oil up, according to David Lamb, from roughly $3 a barrel to around $40 a barrel, with the blessings of the United States. And the Shah used to give lectures from San Moritz about how higher oil prices were a useful discipline for the Western world, and particularly the United States, because it would train us in conservation and good things like that. And Kissinger and others were pleased to see all those gigantic additional revenues pouring into Iran, which enabled Iran to buy billions of dollars of armaments from American manufacturers, which armaments, of course, as you all know, were used in stabilizing the Middle East. It's in the fight with Iraq. No, I think that I'm sure that the Kuwaiti effort, public relations effort, will be very good. It'll be very well financed. As I say, it's estimated the funds they have range from 100 billion to 400 billion. But I honestly don't think any American wants to see one American killed, gassed, shot, maimed, shot down in a plane, to restore to his throne Jabir al-Amhed al-Sabah. Anyone else? Sheldon, sure. Anyone else, by the way, please come in and contribute.
One quick point on this claim that the United States ought to be keeping order in the world. There's a principle in philosophy that ought implies can. It makes absolutely no sense to debate whether the United States ought to be keeping order in the world, because it cannot keep order in the world. And anyone who looks over American military and diplomatic history will realize that it's impossible. To the extent that it tries, it will reap the opposite.
I don't know about your writings, but I suspect a few members of your group from the conservative bent only a year ago would have heartily endorsed America as the police power of the world when communism was involved. What has changed?
Well, let me make an important distinction there. The Soviet enterprise, by their own admission, incidentally, increasingly, and by the documents that are coming out and by the testimony of liberated Soviets, liberated by glasnost, or people who have come over to our side, the Soviet Union under Stalin and Brezhnev, Andropov, the rest, up until this new and radical change, was and defined itself as our main enemy. It had global ambitions. The communist Chinese, who were at one time closely allied, repeated over and over again that the Soviet policy was world hegemony. The Soviet Union was and is, by the way, a powerful nation, a huge nation stretching through 11 time zones, which had thousands of missiles, not hoping to get them 5 years down the road, but had them. They were aimed at us. And anyone who would have at that time suggested preemptive strikes would have been described as a loony. I don't know any conservatives who were in favor of that. The policy was containment, erosion, the use of information to weaken the grip of the Soviet dictatorship on its people and reduce its militarism. But the Soviet Union was a very real threat to the United States. It's hard to believe that a little country like Iraq, surrounded by countries, for example, like Turkey, which is a member of NATO, a country that's gone through an 8-year war that debilitated it and exhausted its treasury, is a threat to the United States or the world. It takes a great imagination to suppose that. So again, to distinguish between the Soviet Union, which at that time, of course, also controlled all of Eastern Europe, had salience in North Korea and Cuba and so forth and so on. Now all that has changed, but let's not forget the way it was. There's a big difference between the Soviet Union, which in all its training manuals described the United States as the main enemy, which used diplomacy, military pressure, everything else to encircle the United States. Now that's changed. We're happy about that. There are still some conservatives who believe that it's all a trick. They're welcome to that thought. I think maybe on the part of some conservatives, one of the reasons for the joyful warmongering vis-a-vis this little family squabble among Arabs in the Middle East is that they sort of are lonesome for a main enemy themselves. And suddenly this hobgoblin, like a Macy balloon rounding the corner, suddenly Hussein, the great enemy, emerges, and unless we kill him now, destroy him, reduce his country to rubble, God knows what will happen. I think there's maybe a psychological transference there. I'm not sure.
Bill?
Yes.
Reed Irvine, Accuracy of Media. I guess it was, forget which one it was, somebody talked about our tendency, those of us who support the president's actions, looking down the road and seeing all kinds of disasters ahead. I take it that this group sees no disasters ahead if Saddam Hussein is victorious, if he achieves his objectives, if he takes over Kuwait.
I didn't say that, and you know I didn't say that. I said that we approve the policy to put diplomatic, economic, and other pressures.
Bill, may I finish?
Yes. But don't misrepresent the position of the committee.
My understanding was that the idea that there are going to be all these disasters that would take place if we didn't do anything is misleading. Now, is that not the position?
I don't understand what you're talking about.
Are you chess players?
No one is saying.
Are you looking down the road and saying that Saddam should be stopped or he shouldn't be stopped?
Well, Saddam should be stopped is one of those fairly nebulous phrases. And aggression has been committed. The UN. Yeah. Oh,
sorry.
The United Nations has authorized certain actions, such as economic sanctions. It's approved after some hesitation, military action to enforce that in terms of a blockade. The United States has made it clear repeatedly that our military forces are there on the ground not to launch an attack or to threaten, as I believe you did. You suggested, Reed, in one of your writings that we should offer to nuke them. I can imagine the effect that might have on the third world. The United States having...
What effect would it have on Saddam if we threatened to nuke him?
Well, if our threat was empty, probably have no effect. Well, that means you'd want to carry it out, and I think that would put the United States in the doghouse in the world for, I don't know, unforeseeable time to come. The only two bombs we dropped are on Japan. Now we drop one in the middle of the Arab world. It seems to me that these extravagant solutions are far beyond the nature of the problem.
Could I get somebody to address that? Because I don't think you've addressed the question. What is your scenario for the future if we don't do anything?
Well, someone else...
I guess it was Mr. Collier that
Sure.
said that these were all exaggerated
Well,
fears.
just making an aside, you asked if any of us were chess players. I mean, I happen to be a nationally ranked chess master. You know? But,
Maybe you'll tell us what lies ahead.
Well,
alternative scenarios.
I'm not a prophet. If I could tell what lies ahead, I'd be investing in Wall Street much more than I am. I would say this. For people who know say that the absolute minimum amount of time it would take Saddam Hussein to become a nuclear power is 10 years. I know of no one who knows anything about nuclear fission or nuclear materials who predicts that he will have a nuclear bomb before then.
Could you speak up?
Now, okay, I don't know anyone who knows anything about nuclear fission or who thinks that he has the ability to get a nuclear bomb before then. I think that given the nature of the regime in Iraq, that it's essentially based on Saddam Hussein and his own family, his own village, you can make an argument that if nothing happened, it's doubtful whether he would be in charge of Iraq in 10 years. But it seems to me that the people who are urging us now, that there are several people who have said that restoring the status quo is not sufficient. They've said that if Hussein does everything we want, if he leaves Kuwait, the Emir is back on the throne, everything's exactly the way it was before Iraq invaded Kuwait, that's not enough. They said we've got to do something to stop Saddam Hussein because he'll be a real threat way down the road. If that's true, those people should have been urging war against Iraq 3 and 4 weeks ago. Instead, a lot of them were urging trade with him. And I think that I would say that what if Saddam Hussein gets everything he wants? He clearly hasn't gotten everything he wants. What he wanted was a lot more oil wealth than he had. He's certainly not getting that. And there's absolutely no prospect that he will get that if he stays in Kuwait. So I think the idea, aren't we in danger if Saddam gets everything he wants? I don't see any possible scenario where Saddam gets everything he wants. You can talk about measured response, how to deal with him. I would say that the people in the region probably know much more about it and how to stop him than a lot of us do.
That's why they're all united behind us.
Well, they're not united behind us. But if you think they are, you're not reading what they say.
With Reed Irvine, we're having a press conference. Yes, sir.
Phil Jones from the IR News Service.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering how you see the Soviet angle in this. At this point, of course, today Gerasimov has gone out saying supporting U.S. presence there, but there's obviously a lot of difference of opinion within the Soviet hierarchy. It would seem to me that there is a danger that if there were any form of military action, the Soviets would also see this, or there might be a shift in the hierarchy, seeing this as a threat to their traditional interest in the Arab world. What do you see?
I think it's a very good point to raise. Gennady Gerasimov just yesterday noted that there are not only those 103 military technical advisors, but there are about 7,000 Soviet civilians advising on agriculture and so on. I don't know why the Soviets would be able to advise anyone else on agriculture, but also I'd like to note that one of the phrases used is, this man, if he, with his hatred of the West, with his hatred of his all-consuming, almost insane hatred of the West, if he gets a nuclear weapon, you know, and rockets and gee, well, I'd like to ask if his hatred of the West was so obvious, so evident, and so deep-rooted, why were there so many thousands of Westerners in the country that now are being held there and so on, some of them? The fact is that Iraq was buying 25% of our rice crop, a sizable percentage of our wheat. They were doing business with American corporations to the tune, I think, in excess of $1 billion a year in all kinds of equipment, non-military equipment, and even here and there, I suppose, some kinds of things that could have both kinds of uses. But there were Austrians there were Australians there were Italians, lots of Americans, lots of British. A country that really is consumed with hatred of the West doesn't have that many businessmen from the West. You don't find thousands of Westerners in Albania, thousands of Westerners in the Iran of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Those are countries that are consumed by an irrational, consuming hatred of the West. If you want to say that Iraq is upset about America's policy in certain areas in the Middle East, then that is true of every Arab nation. Also, this total consensus of the Arab nations, first of all, it isn't all the Arab nations, it's a divided Arab League. Secondly, I'd like to reflect that this is a kind of a domestic quarrel in the Arab nation. There have been such quarrels before. Now, for example, Egypt and Saudi Arabia are standing side by side, but Sadat, for example, referred to the rulers, the Saud family, as they are not giants, they are midgets sitting on piles of money. Just a little while ago, the great hobgoblin in the Middle East that was a great threat to the world were the Syrians, right? The butcher of Hamas, the bankroller of all sorts of terrorism. Now I understand at least 5,000 Syrian troops, our gallant ally, are in Saudi Arabia, though the Saudis will not allow any American reporters to interview those units. And Senator Sam Nunn comes back and says, I want more Arabs, I want more Egyptians, I want more Syrians in there. Frankly, I think that we may have jumped the gun in not permitting an Arab solution to arise. It might have taken a little longer and so forth. We are now clearly seen by the world as the massive military power injected in the area, one of the most rapid military buildups in history. We are also clearly seen as the only nation where there are cries for preemptive attacks. Saddam Hussein, whatever his malice and malignancy down the road, is not calling for war. Even his, we regard it as a kind of a ugly and shameless thing that he's putting civilians around at various targets that Newsweek and so on will show you little arrows how to hit them, is doing, I think, frankly, what any reasonable ruler would do if he was panicked and thought that he was about to be bombed. He might say, well, this might give them pause because the first bombs they drop will kill some of their own citizens. Again, it's a council of desperation and fear, but the world has not perceived that they are interested now in war. So if there's a war, and we've had all this talk about us going to war preemptively, I'm afraid we're going to take the responsibility for being the initiators of the armed conflict. Yes?
Jim Borwick, freelancer.
I'm sorry, could you speak up?
Yeah, my name is Jim Borwick. I'm a freelancer.
Okay.
I saw your packet. There were a lot of handouts, a lot of articles by others. I was wondering why you all formed a committee rather than just writing articles to newspapers.
Well, I think because the issue is a very, very important issue. We're on the brink, possibility of a very, very serious war in which there could be thousands, even 10,000s of casualties, according to General Odom and others. We want to make it clear that there is a reasoned and articulate opposition to those who are calling for the President to have objectives beyond the objectives he stated and to take measures beyond the measures he has said he is taking. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the microphone here. If any of the other panelists want to add.
I'd like to address a question to Joe.
Your name is Ralph Hallow of the Washington Times. Thank you.
Joe, does Israel enter into this equation, and if so, how?
Well, you know, one of the things I've noticed in this whole debate has been the assumption on both sides that war in this area would be in the interest of Israel. And that I find just amazing to think. I mean, we can afford to lose a war there. Israel can't, to put it very bluntly. And I think that if hostilities erupt, it would be 1914 all over again. There's just no telling what would happen. The smallest countries would obviously be the most vulnerable. So instead of taking the sort of Likud outlook on the interests of Israel, I think people ought to attend to wiser Israelis like General Yehoshaphat Harkabi in his book Israel's Fateful Hour, which I think is one of the wisest books I've ever read on the Middle East. He's the former head of Israeli military intelligence. His book caused a great stir in Israel, did not have the impact I think it should have had here. But on another matter here, I'd like to add something to what Phil said. That, you see, I think part of our problem is that we get so many apocalyptic predictions of what Saddam Hussein would do down the road. He's been likened to Hitler about 7,000 times now. And yet, what has he actually managed to do? Not what are his intentions, but what can he do? This is a little like what Sheldon said a while ago about the relation between ought and can. Ought not and cannot are also related in some way. It took him 8 years to win a small strip of Iran, which he quickly had to throw back in order to retain Kuwait. This man is not a world conqueror. I don't care what he wants to do. He may want to conquer Mars. He's not going to do it. Now, to talk as if he's someday going to attack the U.S. with nuclear weapons is preposterous on several counts. For one thing, he has to have a delivery system. For another thing, he has to be unafraid to do it. For another thing, he needs some kind of provocation, which he may now have, in a sense. We'll give away a point on that one. And finally, the U.S. would be one of his chief markets for oil. Now, the prophecies we're getting are so incoherent, I'm having trouble making sense of them. As I understand it, Hussein wants to get all the oil in the region so that he can sell it and get money so that he can amass a nuclear arsenal so that he can destroy the entire oil-consuming world. I hope I've got that straight.
No.
That seems to be what's being predicted here.
Yeah, Sheldon.
Those who throw around the Hitler analogy so quickly ought to contemplate the following thing. The original Hitler was created in part by the very tactic that we are today using against the Iraqi people, namely a starvation blockade, which was imposed by the Allies on Germany toward the end of World War I, and which lasted several months after that war, which created immense resentment against France and Britain, and ended in the hurricane that hit in 1939.
Okay, are there any other questions? By the way, the point that Joe made about the cheerful prediction that somehow or other a war there would be in the benefit of Israel, I refer you to, I think it's in the press, it's a very perceptive column by Richard Cohen in the Washington Post, who points out, and as I say, the whole thing is there, so I won't tax you with it, he ends up, but the United States faces no Holocaust and a resort to military action is not yet justified. Those who plump for war are a bit premature, attempting to make the Middle East safe for not only oil, but for Israel. A war, though, is one way to imperil both. And I notice that Israel is not, although of course there have been reports that Israel is urging us to start shooting, I refer you to the current issue, I think it's the current issue, the August 30th issue of the Washington Jewish Week. Shamir denies Israel urging U.S. to launch attack against Iraq. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir denied Tuesday what he called ugly media reports in the United States that Israel is urging Washington to take military action and so on.
Bill, may I get in a repost here?
Well, yes, if we don't have another question, because I want to be fair.
Nobody will save you.
I just want to ask you, do you see your role as serving to form some kind of an anti-war movement? There has been, up until now, opposition from the left and now to the right. And do you think there's a basis for that at this point?
I do think so. I think that second thoughts are settling in. A lot of people are saying, what is the reason for, not reasonable action, not proportionate action, but a war, initiating a war. That's what we're talking about. Not a little action like Panama, where they don't have a single field piece or a tank. It's basically their so-called army was, first of all, not all that loyal, and secondly was, as we know from the coup attempt, which we should have supported, but from the degree of resistance. In the case of Grenada, the resistance was, as somebody said, a group of Cubans with automatic repeating shovels. We're not talking about one of those exciting little, today it's thin, tomorrow it's over. We're talking about tangling in a hornet's nest with a very powerful hornet. So we would like, peace movement is a term like, like hostage. That is ambiguous or equivocal. A lot of us think in terms of hostages of the Iran situation. In Iran, the provocation was the seizing of our embassy and the taking of Americans as hostages. Let us not forget that no Americans and no Europeans were touched by Iraq until after we had a naval blockade. And then for the stated reason of dissuading us from a preemptive attack, because in such an attack we would have to be killing Americans and other Europeans. Yes, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought there was a hand back. Reed? Oh, okay, Reed, you're right after. I mean, you've already had 2 shots. I want to let everyone else in on this.
You suggested earlier that one of the goals that your coalition has is to gain support by members of Congress in a more level-headed approach to the escalation in the Persian Gulf. Do you at this point have that some congressional support? Are there some key congressmen or senators that are supporting
the Congress has just come back from vacation, as has the President, and there have been congressmen who have gone over there, told us the morale is high, but some of the men are complaining they have to sleep on top of tanks and there's snake tracks in the ground and they're a little worried about the scorpions. It's not the happiest scene in the world. I guess they can get Pepsi over there. They cannot get Coca-Cola because, as you know, like the products of several dozen American companies, the Arab boycott is in effect because if you sell Coca-Cola in Israel, you can't sell Coca-Cola in Saudi Arabia. There's time for the Congress to start thinking about what it is we are doing and to what extent we should be going to war for, what is it? World order? That's a very nice thing. There's a lot of violations of world order. Liberia, which is a country we created and which we administered almost indirectly for some time, and after that the Firestone Rubber Company. They've had a bloody disaster, chaos going on there for months and months and months. If we were world policemen, we would only need to send 1 squad car with a guy with a truncheon to solve that one. We have decided it isn't a good idea for us to get mixed up in that one. The border of India and Pakistan is combustible. There have been, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 wars or skirmishes there. We're talking in that case about 2 countries that have the nuclear weapon, both India and Pakistan. We're talking about a country, in the case of India, with 15 million people, Pakistan 120 or whatever it is million people. If there's a flare-up there, as suddenly as there was in the Kuwait situation, should America send another expeditionary force over there to straighten out the problems between India and make everything all hunky-dory on the subcontinent? You see what gets into when you assign yourself the role of world policeman, and then you suddenly find you have nothing in the budget to pay for the cops, by the way, which is another thing. We have to pick our engagements carefully and try to make our response reasonable but proportional to the violation of world order. And we're not the only, no one assigned us to be in charge of world order. I think someone else mentioned it. There have been countries, Britain, for example, that would send a few, Gurkhas out to bash down some unruly sepoys or lash some sullen Lascars somewhere or bash some Boers who were getting out of hand. Imagine those Boers being in charge of all the diamonds and golds in the world. When we had the Suez crisis 20 years ago or so, you will recall that was aptly described as the lion's last roar, when Britain, France, and Israel in a covert agreement decided to teach Nasser, that uppity Egyptian, a lesson. And you go back and read the rhetoric. Dulles talked about Nasser's Hitlerite pretensions.
Some of us have deadlines in daily newspapers, and I realize it, but I do have a question that relates to today's events. I noticed that all of the people that are in your press kit, or virtually all of them, who you say are calling for war with Iraq, might be described as neoconservatives. And I see none of the people, all 3 writers at the table, do I identify as neoconservatives? Are we to draw some inference from that?
Being a journalist, you're entitled to draw any inference you want, and being a journalist, you will. But the fact is, of course, that neoconservative is a somewhat broad definition. We have Gene Kirkpatrick, for example, as I understand it, is not enthusiastic for war. I don't think you could describe Henry Kissinger as a neoconservative. I don't know there's any label that fits him except perhaps Henry Kissinger. So there are many people who seem to want to get us into this war in a hurry. I certainly don't think you could call Reed Irvine a neoconservative, and Reed is in favor of threatening nuclear annihilation. So I guess a lot of the more prominent advocates of this kind of attack are neoconservatives, but again, National Review, it's an unsigned editorial, but that's hardly a neoconservative publication.
So could I get my follow-up here?
Sure.
I'm still trying to figure out what your scenario is. I get one scenario is that this is a little country that is no threat to anyone. It's, on the other hand, it's a dangerous hornet, a powerful hornet that's going to set off World War III if
Reed,
we attack it.
you're in favor of accuracy in media.
Now,
You ought to start with not misrepresenting what you just heard.
Well, let me give you a scenario. It'll be all on tape.
Yeah,
We
let's
can
hear
refer
your
to the
scenario
record.
rather than
Let's
your
see, let's see what your
characterization of
scenario
ours.
is it that we are going to sit in Saudi Arabia indefinitely to protect Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein? Or is it that we pull out and Saddam Hussein will have no further aspirations beyond Kuwait? Is it that he is not going possibly to get a nuclear weapon anytime within the next decade, even though he might attack Israel? Israel has atomic weapons. If he succeeded in attacking Israel, he could presumably get Israel's atomic capability. Or if he takes over Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and gets this enormous wealth, doesn't that give him some capability of acquiring other resources?
Well,
Anyway.
sure. Yeah.
Well, again, you're sort of assuming powers to Saddam Hussein that he doesn't really have. For example, from Baghdad right to Kuwait City, there's a gigantic highway, very easy to drive down there. An army driving from Baghdad to Kuwait is essentially a cakewalk. It's very easy. If we assume that he was out to attack Saudi Arabia, he would have had to go across some of the worst deserts in the world, and again, he would have been up against an army which is not insignificant. I mean, the Saudi army is not insignificant. I'm talking about, again, if he was intending to go into Saudi Arabia, he should have done it when he had the chance. He didn't. He stopped immediately at Kuwait. And again, you're saying, if Saddam Hussein took over the entire Arab world, well, I don't think he has the power to do that, but even if he...
Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states.
Okay, if he took over all the Gulf states, first of all, I don't think he has the power to do that. I think if we had done nothing, if the United States didn't exist or was a completely isolationist country, not even trading or doing anything or ignoring him, I think that what would happen if he did that, when you try and build an empire, which is what he would be doing, how would he have controlled it? He would have had to have satraps, he would have had to do various other things, he would eventually provoke revolts, even before he went into Kuwait, he had to execute 100 top army officers because they had second thoughts about it. Now, I think...
Is that verified?
I believe I've seen so many reports to it.
Was it verified?
It was rumored, but I would put it this way: from what I know about Iraq, I don't doubt that story. There are many Iraqi refugees who've left Iraq. He has enough trouble. The kind of regime he has trouble keeping the lid on. And I'll give you one example. After the Iran-Iraq war winded up, he had thousands of returning soldiers who didn't have jobs, didn't have this and didn't have that. And the Iraqi regime, I think, was suddenly afraid for its own legitimacy. And what did it do? It had elections. It had some parliamentary elections, which about a year and a half ago, a friend of mine who was there said he was stunned to find out the elections were relatively free. And he was thinking that perhaps the Iraqi regime was afraid for its own legitimacy. The Iraqi regime I also think that one of the reasons why he went into Kuwait, this is a hypothesis, is that he was having real internal trouble, which might be...
Can we count then? We can pull our troops back from Saudi Arabia and everything will be fine.
Well, one scenario, I'm saying what we can or can't do is to some extent contingent on Saudi Arabia. Theoretically, at any time they want, the Saudi Arabians can call us up and say, please leave, because they invited us in. I think that one scenario which is not implausible is that behind-the-scenes diplomacy involving the King of Saudi Arabia and various other powers in the Middle East will broker some kind of agreement with Saddam Hussein, and he might agree to withdraw pending certain elections. I'm not sure what this thing, but it's quite possible that the Arab world will come up with some behind-the-scenes diplomatic resolution and present it to us and say, this is what we want to do, you should leave. I think that's possible.
But should our forces be withdrawn from Saudi Arabia?
Right now?
Because things are safe. Hussein poses no threat, therefore we can withdraw our forces. Can we get the three of you to, at least among yourselves, to tell me what the...
Well, could I say, first of all, Reed, that nobody here has said that we ought to withdraw our forces without their achieving the goal they were sent there for, which I remind you, unless you have sources that are closer to the throne than we do. Our military forces are there, and this was said by their Supreme Commander, the four-star General Norman Schwarzkopf, just yesterday, I think, that our forces are there in a defensive posture to defend Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates from any further Iraqi aggression. That is the purpose of our military. The he also said, and I noticed that Bill Sapphire sort of scolded him for saying that their purpose is not to, and they will not, initiate an attack on Iraq. So if you think that the policy should be something else, you think our forces are there in order to go to war and to have an attack, then that's...
No, I'd like to know what you think.
No, I think they're, well...
And what Joe thinks, and what Mr.
They're
Richmond
there
thinks.
in a defensive posture
Are we wasting
for as
time and money by
long as Saudi Arabia, which has made clear and which we have made clear, Cheney said it over and over, we're there by leave of the Saudis. The minute they ask us to leave, we'll leave. It's conceivable that other forces, I noticed that Sam Nunn thinks there should be more Syrian forces there. There already, I mentioned before, at least 5,000. It's possible that a mostly Arab joint force will be a sufficient deterrent for further aggression. If the Saudis think so and ask us to leave, yes, I think we should leave. Do you think we should stay if the Saudis ask us to leave?
Well, how long are we going to stay? 20 years? 30 years? 50 years?
How long have we been in South Korea?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
How long have we been in Western Europe?
Are you proposing that American forces stay there
anything.
for indefinitely?
I'm not proposing. I'm proposing that the alternative to patience, good Lord, this thing isn't more than 20 days old, that the alternative to some patience and to the use of economic pressure, diplomacy, et cetera, initiating a war, a nuclear war, for God's sake, is not at all a rational policy. It's both irrational, it's harmful to our vital national interests. That's what we're opposing. We're not saying that no troops should be there or that Saudi Arabia shouldn't have a military cordon. Joe, or I'm sorry, Sheldon.
There are very likely disagreements among members of this committee on some aspects of this. If you think a preemptive strike is a way to get the U.S. troops out quickly, I think you're sadly mistaken. That's the way to stay in.
What do you think? What I think is not important. What do you think?
I would withdraw them.
You would withdraw them now. Joe?
Yeah, I'd find a way out as soon as possible. Cut a deal with Hussein or whatever it takes. But I tell you one thing. The nature of the question tells me what the problem is, that the presumption is in favor of war. I think anyone who wants to send American boys over where they're likely to get blown to bits bears the burden of proof for showing why we should do it. That burden has not been met.
So you want to, you'd pull them out quickly?
As quickly as possible.
Well, how quickly is that? Tomorrow?
I don't know, because I wouldn't have put them in there, Reed. And I wouldn't bomb. I wouldn't drop the
Phil, would you
atomic
have put them
bomb.
in?
Excuse me, I wouldn't drop the atomic bomb on Iraq either.
Fine. Would you have put them in, Phil?
Well, I'm not in charge of putting them in or putting them out, and I think that if you want my frank opinion on this, the massiveness of the deployment of this expeditionary force, which now with the arrival of heavy tanks and so on, does to the world look like a potential attack force, is possibly an overreaction on the part of the military to the Vietnam syndrome, which was gradual incrementalism. I think this time, and where Lyndon Johnson sat around telling the pilots what wheelbarrows they could bomb and what wheelbarrows they couldn't, I think now the military is sort of overreacting. The pendulum is swung. And I think George Bush said, you guys in the military, deploy what you think makes sense. Here's the mission. And they decided, before the Congress is back, before there can be second thoughts, let's move in with force, and the maximum, the more the merrier. It's also pretty good for the military as putting them on center stage. Bernie Yo, yes.
I'm disappointed that, we're talking about things of the past. What we should do now from today onward, and what, let's give some idea of kind of solution. Now let me try a solution, see how you react to it. Because after all, the whole thing started when Iraq accused Kuwait of stealing their oil through slant drilling.
Slant drilling, yeah.
That's interesting, you can drill slant. I didn't know you can do that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's send a international panel of experts to go to Kuwait and take a look. Did they slant drill? If they did, the problem is solved. Say, hey, Kuwait, look, you've been stealing your neighbor's oil. No. He said, no, now Iraq, pull your troops out, America, pull our troops out. Kuwait should pay Iraq X amount of oil money, whatever. The whole thing is over. You see, what do you think of that solution?
Well, Bernie, I think I like any solution to this relatively minor squabble within the Arab nation, as I see it, that has been magnified into a global cause. I like any solution that can solve this problem, the remedies for which now already seem to exceed any harm that was envisaged. I mean, what was the worst thing that Iraq could have done if he hated the West and had all that oil of Kuwait and Iraq? The worst thing he could have done was not to sell any to anybody. Keep it off the world market. Surest way to push up the prices. What have we done? We've kept the Iraq and Kuwait oil off the world market. We pushed the prices up. Remember that only 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, we sent naval forces over there to do what? To prevent any military force from preventing Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil from reaching the world market. We allowed the entire Kuwaiti tanker fleet, which is, by the way, one of their side businesses, very large fleet. We reflagged them all with American flags and then put them under the protection of an American fleet to prevent Iran from interfering with the free flow of Iraqi and Kuwaiti oil into world markets. Now we have a bigger armada over there preventing Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil from entering world markets. It is a little puzzling for those people who are trying to follow the rationale here. As far as, you know, the World Court and Arab ulema being convened to decide who's to blame or who should be getting this or that, we're all in favor of that. We don't see this as an attack on the United States. We think it's a break in world order. It's a break in world order when Turkey marches into Cyprus and still holds 1/3 of Cyprus. It's a break in world order when India, back in the 50s, seized Goa, which was Portuguese and didn't want to be Indian. There are, regrettably, all sorts of naughty things going on in the world. In black-on-black violence in South Africa just in the last week, probably more than twice as many people have been killed than in the 4-hour takeover of Kuwait. What I'm saying is we shouldn't magnify this into the domain of hobgoblins and let's mobilize the whole country and call up the reserves and then those say, let's go to war, because if we don't now, better a little war now than a big war later. This is a very, very dangerous siren call, and it won't be such a little war now. It could be, you know, what could happen later? Hussein could be out of power. Has anyone followed events in the Middle East closely? Longevity is not characteristic of the regimes in the area. Assassination, coups, all sorts of things do take place. And to say, well, let's have a little war now and avoid a big war later is, first of all, there is no little war alternative. Any other questions?
Who are the other powers who are going to cause World War III? It's going to be everybody against Hussein, or has he got some valuable, powerful allies, Phil?
Well, there are other countries in the world with nuclear arsenals.
Allied with Hussein?
Well, I mean, I don't know what your point is, Reed. If Hussein is replaced...
Sarajevo, there was a clash of great powers. Here it's everybody against one...
Well, you think Iraq is a great power, really?
No.
No.
That's why I don't think it's going to be World War III.
You're mistaking the regimes with the people. Those
Yeah.
regions, so not everybody against Iraq.
Who controls the military? The rulers, right?
It change overnight.
Oh.
Yes, it has.
It has.
Look at the Shah. Right.
He was our SOP.
Did I not thank everybody? In which case, I apologize, and I thank everybody twice. Thank you very much for coming. Sure.
That concludes this briefing held by the Committee to Avert a Mideast Holocaust. Be sure to join us later this afternoon, beginning at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, for live coverage of a hearing held by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Testifying before the panel concerning recent events in the Persian Gulf will be Secretary of State James Baker III. Stay with us now for a call-in program recorded earlier today dealing with events in the Persian Gulf region. Located in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Middle East is an area of land comprised of